well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm sure we'll have more people joining in just a minute. I'm Patrick Coleman. I'm the coordinator for the Clarion Workshop and filling in for Karen Joy Fowler, the president of the Clarion Foundation tonight. And I get the profound honor to welcome everyone who's joining us from all parts of the world to be here tonight for this conversation between Cory Doctorow, Karen Osborne, and Kali Wallace. And so we're so grateful that you're choosing to spend an hour with us tonight. Before we get underway, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's a part of our Clarion community and who helps make Clarion possible. And wow, missing professional wrestling for this. We're very, very grateful for you to choose us over wrestling. And that goes for all of our supporters, our students, everyone who chips in $5 when the write-a-thon comes around. You're all such an important part of this community, and we're grateful for all of that. So how tonight is going to go is we're going to have about a half an hour of conversation between our three guest writers, and at that point, we'll turn things over to questions from all of you. And so you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. At any point, feel free to add your questions there, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can before the top of the hour. So to get started, let me just briefly introduce our three just incredible writers and Clarion alums. First up is Cory Doctorow, writer, activist, journalist, author of so many amazing books, including most recently the novel Attack Surface, which is connected to his young adult novel Little Brother, just came out earlier this year. Next, we have Karen Osborne, a more recent Clarion alum, who this past year has had 2 novels come out from Tor as part of the Memory War series. The first being The Architects of Memory, and the second being The Engines of Oblivion that just came out recently, and there's that beautiful cover of it. And you can find Karen's short fiction at Uncanny and Fireside and so many other great places where you can find short stories. And last but not least, we have the amazing Kali Wallace, who maybe in terms of college credentials has the most sort of authority on the building of worlds as a PhD in geophysics, but thankfully for us, decided to turn her brain toward writing fiction. Is the author of numerous novels, including the recent and amazing novel Salvation Day, and then her newest book, Dead Space, which just came out last month, a few weeks ago. What is time at this point? But very, very recently. And so we're just so honored and grateful to have 3 amazing science fiction writers here to talk about your skills and approach in telling stories set in the future and alternate worlds, and how you approach this complicated thing that stresses everybody out, which is world building. So at this point, I think I'll turn things over to all of you, and then I'll come back when there's some questions from our audience. But maybe I thought as just a place to start, would each of you mind sharing a little bit about the story and the world of your most recent book and how you developed that? And maybe Kali, since you were last in the intros, can we start with you?
Sure. Yes, I'm Kali Wallace, and my most recent book is a sort of a near future sci-fi mystery. It's called Dead Space, which has nothing to do with the video game franchise Dead Space. We were aware of the same name, but went with it anyway. Everyone asks. And it takes place in a kind of a not terribly distant, but somewhat distant future where like humanity has been able to like travel about as far as the asteroid belt, but not much further in terms of having like living situations. And it's so basically set in a world that is deliberately and like pointedly familiar to our own, something where large corporations have a huge amount of political power, where individual workers have very little power. And that was sort of the driving force behind the narrative. It takes place on a mine, an asteroid mine in the asteroid belt, where basically everyone who lives there, everyone lives in these little like company towns. So you're always reliant on your employer for just about everything, which is not a great way to live, as I'm sure everybody who's ever worked any kind of job knows. But yeah, that is the science fictional setting for Dead Space. It is a mystery thriller, so it's a very sort of claustrophobic kind of story set in this one small space. But the bigger world is meant to be broadly familiar to the sort of economic, political, like driving forces that we are used to.
I guess I'll go next since I was in the middle. I have to read your book. I have to. I have not yet, but I have to, because I also have a corporation book.
Why are we all thinking about that these days? I
don't know. I couldn't possibly figure it out. Is it because that corporations have an outsized impact in how every single one of us lives our lives, and they're slowly gobbling? Anyway. So in the memory war duology, it's about 200 years in the future. The Earth is an ecological disaster, because that's what's going to happen if we keep on letting it go. So, and corporations are the only ones who are able to get off the planet. And if you want to get off the planet, you go and you indenture yourself with a corporation, much like people did in 1618 with the Virginia Company. And so 200 years from now, an alien race appears, and we don't understand them, and they don't understand us. And there is, as these things happen when you can't understand someone else, a very, very bad war. So in the aftermath of this war, in this corporate technology, and in this corporate place, you have Ash, and she is terminally ill. She has a disorder that she picked up in a mine, and she finds a piece of alien technology that doesn't quite act like the rest of the weapons that they found, and it's big and it's major and everybody wants it. So that's where you start with that.
So I wrote Little Brother, the first of these three books, in 2006. And I wrote it after seeing a bad techno thriller. And Bruce Sterling, he says that a techno thriller is a science fiction movie with the president in it. I don't remember if the president was actually in it, but it was definitely that kind of movie. It struck me that that movie and the movies and stories in its genre shared a common pathology, which is that they treated computers as metaphors instead of as things that existed in the world that you could tell stories about. And I found that very frustrating. I mean, it's one thing for that to have been like the motif of Neuromancer, which I think Bill wrote in 1982 and published in 1984, when very few people had used computers, including Bill. He wrote it on a typewriter. But, in 2006, we were spending every hour God sent on our computers, and it's only, gone downhill or uphill from there, depending on your point of view. And it struck me as someone who spent a lot of time campaigning on issues related to technological self-determination and digital liberties and the human rights dimension of digital technology, that there were stories to tell about computers that turned on the actual capabilities and constraints of computers that were, you didn't have to have computers whose cryptography would last for exactly 1 hour and a bomb that was going to go off in 59 minutes and 30 seconds unless you could crack the cryptography, which is not a thing. You could instead have stories that were really built around this. And it was the War on Terror years, and it was a moment in which computers were being turned. I was working with Electronic Frontier Foundation, with whom I still work. It's been 19 years now, and it's a human rights group that campaigns on digital issues. And in 2005, a retired AT&T engineer named Mark Klein walked into our offices in the Mission in San Francisco with a folder full of documents And he said, my boss asked me to build a secret room in the main Folsom Street switching center and to put a beam splitter in our fiber optic trunk and to put an intercept room in that, an intercept suite in that secret room so that the NSA could illegally look at all messages on the internet. And we started suing the US government. And that was the thing. It was actually James Clapper lying about that caused Edward Snowden to become so disgusted with the agencies that he became a whistleblower. And so all of that was going on. And I said, I'm going to write a story that takes computers as they are and that is set in a kind of no time that is 10 minutes in the future and also right now and also 10 years in the future. And it's going to be about the war on terror, surveillance, computers, and seizing the means of computation, about how we contest our technological destiny. It was really successful. It was a New York Times bestseller in paperback and hardcover and widely adapted in all kinds of different media and languages, and just generally has been great, as was the sequel. And the sequel, Homeland, was particularly had a moment that I was very proud of when I went to see the documentary about Snowden. And you see, as he in Citizen 4, the documentary, as he's leaving Hong Kong and going into exile in Russia and grabbing the things that he's going to need to go underground with, he grabs a copy of Homeland off his bedside table and puts it in his bag. And so, having written these two books and in the previous decade, one in the previous decade, one in the early part of this decade, I watched as they remained very current. There was only a little bit of world building that didn't carry over, and that was that the first book didn't have any social media in it. And it wasn't because there wasn't social media, and it wasn't because I didn't see social media being important. I was just hoping it would die. And so I my future. And so with this new one, I went back to the world and I wanted to write something for adults. The first two are YA novels. And I wanted to write not about kids who are contesting the control over the technology in their lives, but I wanted to write about someone who had successfully mastered technology and then turned their life to making sure no one else could control their technology around them. Someone who became a surveillance contractor. And she was a minor character in the first two books, and I'd always wondered about her motivations. And over the years, I'd met so many people who'd come up to me and said, the reason I became a security researcher or human rights lawyer or campaigner was because I read Little Brother and Homeland. And this would be at conferences like DEF CON and CCC and so on. And some of the people there would be spooks who weren't working to free people. They were working to lock them up. And I wrote a story about a moral reckoning for those people. And I wanted to, and I think it's a world building moment, in a moment in which technologists are quitting their jobs, walking out, refusing to build facial recognition technology, refusing to build drone technology, and having deep questions about how their technology is being used, while at the same time you have people like Palmer Luckey, the Oculus guy, gleefully describing how he will use drones to build a virtual wall on the southern border so that desperate people won't be able to claim asylum in America. And that felt like not just a story that was very contemporary, but a story that spoke to my audience as they were wrestling with those contemporary issues.
So I have a question because of what Cory said, because you, correct me if I'm wrong, Cory, but it sounds like you had the idea for the world rather than the specifics of the narrative of the story, like the characters and the, like the journey that they go on first. And I feel like this is something that I get asked a lot, especially by young writers when I do like school visits. They say, what do you think of first? Do you think of the story first, or do you think of the world first? Or how do you know you've built enough world? So I guess I'd be interested in hearing, because you to describe two very different books. And
well, Karen, do you want to go first? I just spoke for a long time.
That's the problem with this is I could speak for a long time on this one too, because
I think we all could. Yeah.
We all could. That's why we're here, right? It's kind of like a Katamari Bowl duology, because I think in narrative sometimes to wander off just a tiny bit and get all like picky about narrative. The faster your book goes, the less world building you can put up front. You have to put it under the hood. And my books are very fast. So when I was revising them, I kept on having to go, whoa, we cannot stop here and talk about this. I have to, we can't stop and talk about the culture. I have to put the culture in the clothes. I have to put the culture in the in the posters on the walls, in what people say to each other, and I have completely forgotten the question.
What do you do, character or worlds first?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Thank you. Definitely the characters come first for me. There's always someone out there having a problem. But this was kind of like a Katamari ball. Like I said, it kind of all came together at once. The character was there because she had a terminal illness. It's modeled on mine, which is not terminal. It could be, but it's not at the moment. And it was kind of like, okay, so she's out here and she is doing this thing. Why is she doing the thing? And you can trace it on back to, and at a certain point, I kind of looked at, okay, so where does her culture come from? And I kind of looked at Elon Musk and what Elon Musk is doing with SpaceX. And I remember the day that he published he published the quotes about going to Mars, and how there's plenty of work on Mars. You can just pay for it once you get there. And I'm just but that stuff is, if you pay attention to the world, if you pay attention to the world as it is and the world as it was in history, you can sort of see these things coming together in the center, where you have a character living their life and you have history, and then it comes sort of like right in the center of, oh, this is what's going on. And then you look at what's there in the center and you start thinking about, okay, the clothes, the things they say, the way they deal with power, et cetera, et cetera. And Cory?
Sorry, I had my my mic off there. That's now it's a Zoom conference. I think that's a great answer. The most smart and resonant thing that anyone said to me about this came from my editor, Patrick Nielsen Hayden at Tor. And he said, in science fiction, the character and the world are like a big gear and a little gear, and their teeth have to mesh. And you've got the world, and you've got which is the really big gear, and you've got the character, which is the small gear that's high torque. And the character spins around and around and around until the world has done a full revolution. And so you've seen the whole world through the character's travails. And that when the story doesn't work, one of the ways that it can fail to work is if the character is not a microcosm of the world, or if the world is not a macrocosm of the character. And that's always been a really smart way for me to analyze when a thing feels like it's not gelling, especially doing instruction, especially if I'm teaching a Clarion, for example, and to think about how the world and the character meet with one another. And in that regard, it doesn't really matter which comes first, because you're always going to iterate, right? Because you're always going to try to get the teeth to mesh. Mesh. Yes. I write about the way that technology affects our human lived experience. That's my bag, is like, what does it feel like to live under a certain kind of technological regime where the nexus of control is here or there,
right?
And that means that irrespective of the world, I imagine the character is going to have a certain kind of journey that might require tweaking the world, and vice versa. And you eventually get there. So for example, about 3 weeks ago, I started work on a novel that's been really just burning through me. It's halfway done now. Nice. That's a thriller, noir thriller about money laundering and cryptocurrency, and it's really about corruption and about the way that corruption has become such a commonplace that we see things like NFT markets and tens of millions of dollars changing hands, and we don't ask where the tens of millions of dollars came from ultimately, and why there's so much liquidity in these markets, and how it is that we have cryptocurrencies. I believe it was in 2018, for most of the year, almost all of the money going into Bitcoin was denominated in Chinese renminbi, which is to say it was money being smuggled out of the country by corrupt officials evading currency controls. And telling a story about the banality of corruption makes for a great hard-boiled tale.
Yep.
And the character, I didn't know who they were when I started. I'm working without an outline. I'm just kind of blasting it out. And he became a forensic accountant. And as soon as he became a forensic accountant, everyone he knew and the shape of his world became a kind of foregone conclusion. And that's how it's been going.
Yeah,
I
no,
love those moments. What about you, Kali?
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, I like what you said about it always being like iterations, because I tend to like backwards engineer most of my world building. I kind of blast through the story and then go back and figure out, okay, what makes this the most interesting, but in the details, but the broad shape it's always a push and pull between the kind of story that you want to tell. And like you said, Karen, the last two books I've written have been like sci-fi thrillers. So they're very fast paced. They take place over like 30 hours, like very speedy. And so fitting all of it in there, it's not like the same kind of world building as like big epic fantasies that sprawl for 20 books, where every detail of the world is determined and fit in and explained and makes sense. It's a very different kind of world building, but it still has the same effect that, like, as I write it, what I'm always thinking is I want people to feel like they could be there, even if it's something that is completely fantastical or, similar to our world, but just a little different, or 10 minutes in the future. You want people to feel like they can be there. And so I feel like a lot of it is you place your character in the world, and then you go back and figure out what makes that world real and interesting and slightly scary, but also, appealing in a way that makes people want to explore it more.
Well, that's like my favorite experience as a you just described my favorite experience as a reader of
Right.
science fiction is when I get in there and I'm like, oh, look at that thing, that and since I write it, I can often go, I see what they're doing there, but to sit down in a scene and have the world unfold in layers, and be able to experience those layers all, without as the character does, it's a really, really powerful experience. And the best writers are the ones that pull that off, I think.
But I think there's also an element of, even if you're familiar with the genre, you've seen all the tricks or whatever, there's still an element of pleasure in being like, oh, I see what they're doing, or I see where this is going. Because, this is something people say when they talk about writing mystery novels, is you always want the reader to feel like just 5 seconds smarter than the characters, just be able to feel, you don't want to condescend to your reader, and you don't want to make them feel stupid, but you also don't want to have everything in your world and in your story be so obscure that they can't grasp onto anything. And so I think there is something about being able to dole out world building in particular on a scale where it makes people it's enjoyable, but they want more. It's like,
it's also kind of improvisational, right? So you describe the world and you throw some details in, and sometimes those details are like a challenge to yourself to come back later and figure out how that detail fits into the world.
Yes.
The
Yes.
critiquing term, the eyeball kick. So you find your eyeball kick and you stick it in there, and then you figure out how it fits in the world. There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's a fun way of doing it. It's only indulgent if you don't figure out how it goes into the world and then forget to delete it. It's fine to throw as many of those as you want in as you're writing. You just have to remember to go back and delete them.
Yeah, no, I think definitely, I don't ever want to discourage people from keeping the fun, cool stuff. It has to fit in the story, but if you're like, wow, that's awesome, and you put it in, that's good. That's a sign that you're enjoying what you're writing, and it's probably going to show.
Well,
Yeah.
it can sometimes lead to really, really great things in the plot too, because like I remember when I was first writing architects, I was just doing it for fun. I was doing it for like NaNoWriMo, going, this is fun. Let me get back my, fun feeling about writing again. And I wrote this word and it was called RenderBot. And I was like, that sounds fun. A render bot. I love a render bot. Like, I'm a videographer. I know what rendering does. I can see what it is. And the whole thing, and like, it changed the whole end of Engines of Oblivion, like that technology existing. By the time I got to the end of the second book, it was absolutely crucial. You can't tell the story without it. So I love it. I love it when that sort of thing happens as a writer, and just keeping track of it is the issue, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's somewhere between a writing prompt and a dare.
Yeah.
I
think it's especially fun because I really enjoy the like creative problem solving aspect of writing. And when you give yourself that dare, it can be a lot of fun to make yourself be like, okay, how does this fit in? And, go take a long walk and think about it for a long time and go to sleep on it. You wake up the next day and you're like, okay, I think I can make that work. But it's not always immediately obvious.
And what I find, I tend to work on lots of stuff at once. I'm working on 2 novels right now, and I finished a short story today. And what I find is that the hacky, stupid idea that I have to get the plot to work in story A, if I use it in story B, is an incredibly off the wall lateral move.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's pretty good.
That has happened so many times. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why another thing I always tell, especially young writers, is jot down all of your stupid ideas, your thoughts, your half-formed ideas, because you never know, like, what you're thinking about one day is going to be useful to something else that you haven't even thought of yet.
Well, and for me, I for 20 years now have written a blog, and the blog consists of originally it was much heavier on this is a thing that I found interesting, and then it was this is a thing I found interesting and why. And now it's this is a thing that I found interesting, here's why, and here's how it connects to everything else that I've written about over the last 2 years.
The world is full of interesting things.
Yeah, and that's very mnemonic, right? It makes your imagination into a kind of super saturated soup of like fragmentary story ideas. And then, when a couple of them bang together and nucleate, what crystallizes out is something that's really interesting, synthetic and syncretic, right? That pulls together non-obvious connections between things that are definitionally interesting, because that's why you stuck them in there to begin with. And what you got is something that's even more interesting than either of them on their own.
Yeah.
That it's so true, because I've rarely ever come up with something and it's like this whole idea like descending from the heavens vis-a-vis Athena, coming straight out of the forehead. And like it's like everything I've ever published is always like, oh, that might work with that, or it's like some sort of wacky prompt that takes A from A column, or B from B column, or C from C column. And that's why I think to be a good world builder, you have to do what Cory does and take the things and write about them and think about them and do the research and engage yourself with things that are fun and interesting to you. Because so they'll be there when you're ready to use them in your work.
It's like taking things out and handling them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Just like having a box of keepsakes that you take out and you handle every now and again. And just handling them makes them accessible to you and keeps them like cooking in your mind. I every day I go through Tumblr and I find between 20 and 100 vintage images of some description or other, a lot of old ads and brutalist architecture, retrofuturism, just stuff that the people I follow have found. And I take them and I put them on Twitter, and it's like a 5-step process where you copy the image and paste it into Twitter, and you copy the text and you paste it into Twitter, then you copy the link and you paste it into Twitter, and then you hit submit. And it's like transplanting a seedling to a garden. And just the act of touching it and handling it, just this kind of continuous like string of like visual, interesting, atemporal elements, you know, yesterday's futures, today's yesterdays, the aspirations, the failed aspirations, the realized banal aspirations, all that stuff, like when combined makes for such a kind of readily accessible set of images and ideas that can just fill in like the background. It's like having lots of soup stock around to make your soup with.
Yeah, I think Karen, you said something about like the best world builders, and I think the one thing I think oftentimes like science fiction fantasy writers, not in the community, but get like a reputation like, oh, you know, building worlds that are like different or escapist. But I think the best world builders are the ones who are deeply interested in our world and the history and the future, and spend a lot of time reading about it, learning about it, like going out in it, paying attention to it, interacting with it. And so it's like constantly feeding that, you know, feeding that well of ideas with, you know, who knows what, anything, with science, history, with psychology, with, you know, whatever, because I feel like the best world building in the best stories comes from people who are deeply, deeply curious.
Well, that's how that's how brains work, right? And back when I was selling wedding videos and making wedding videos for a living, I forget if it's 3 touches or 7 touches where you would reach out 3 or 7 times. I forget what it is. It used to be 3, now it's 7. Maybe now it's like 25, who knows? But you could never like sell a wedding video on 1 touch alone. You had to engage with the person 3, 4, 5 times. And that could be anything like tweeting something, or that could be anything from, you know, having a conversation with them. And one of the things that affected my writing and the ability to really move from just writing in my bedroom to writing here, hi, I can't believe I'm here right now. Okay. Was like looking back and if you do that to yourself with your own ideas, if you reach in and you engage with them over and over and over again, you'll get to know them more and you'll want to do business with them. If that makes any sense.
I followed it.
Yeah.
It seems like you've found a very good way to do business with those ideas. Well, I wanted to jump in because we have some great questions, and some of them are really connecting with what the 3 of you are talking about right now. And the first one, you know, I think it has a lot to do with that quality of touching something over and over again. And so Terry's asking, you know, your thoughts about, you know, maybe techniques or some tricks you've learned about kind of expressing the world through the eyes of your characters. And so I'm curious, you know, Karen, since you were last, let's go back to you. I mean, what kinds of things have you picked up for how to bring those worlds to life through the eyes and perspectives of the characters themselves?
Well, we don't normally think of our worlds like the way we experience our worlds every day is our senses, and that's actually something I learned at Clarion, relying more on your senses, because we get up and we taste our coffee and we you know, go outside and we put on our coat that's made of feathers, down feathers, and we don't really think of where the down feathers come from. We don't think of where the coffee comes from, who picks the coffee, who makes the coffee. So that's a great place to start, is look through your character eyes. What are they seeing? What are they tasting? What are they feeling? Who are they talking to? What is that person wearing? Just really, really basic stuff, starting from there. And then sort of peeling back the layers on what that is.
I have never used, but I've always admired Joe Haldeman's approach to this, which is that he just writes the story, then he goes back and on every page inserts a sensory detail. Just like literally just mechanically inserts it, like, oh, this page, like I need a smell on this page, finds a place where someone might smell something and writes it in. I think that there's a lot of stuff that feels mechanical when you do it that actually plays really well in narrative. we all want art to be like numinous, irrational, and unpin downable, but you know, there are methods.
Yeah, we're just writing words down.
Yeah. Moorcock has this essay about how you write a novel in 2 weeks. And it's just this incredibly mechanical process, which produced some of the canonical works of our field, you know, also produced a lot of garbage. But, you know, there are people who agonized over novels for years and produced both garbage and canonical novels of our field. So I don't think we can blame it on the time scale. And he certainly got to buy a lot more lottery tickets in the write something canonical lotto.
But and how about, so Kali, one of the questions we'll start with you is, you know, does any of that change when you're writing short fiction versus a novel? I mean, you've written a lot of both.
Yeah, I would say, well, I will also, with the caveat that the number one comment on my short fiction is that the world is too big for it and they wish there was more. It's like, oh, this isn't, and that's not always a compliment. It's oftentimes a criticism. But I would say that when I'm writing short fiction, it's very much about a moment in time. And so the only part of the world that is visible is what is impacting that moment. And like, I mean, moment, it could be, you know, days or weeks or whatever, although usually in my stories, it's like a couple hours. But so a lot of times I don't even like build the world much beyond that, although I'll have like vague sense of it. But as far as details, like, you know, if it takes place in like a fantastical setting, like I don't care how the economies of this magical kingdom work because it's not relevant to what's happening to the characters like in that moment. Whereas when I'm writing a novel, which would be, you know, even in a similar setting, I find that I often have to think about that stuff, even if it never goes into the book, which it often doesn't. Most, like the one like second world fantasy that I've written so far is a children's book. So there's not a lot of, you know, like boring political, social, economic detail in there. But I had to think about it just so I could make this world in which this 12-year-old girl lives and dreams because of what she wants and what kind of changes her life can have and what her life is like now and why she wants it to be different, to feel realistic. So I would say that for me at least, short stories often what's on the page is most of what I've imagined. Whereas with novels, there's like, it's like iceberg. There's so much more that is thought out, written down in notes that never like shows up on the page directly.
I want to politely offer an alternate way of thinking about the short story without wanting to doubt any of that. I think that a short story is a place where the trick is over so quickly that its flaws aren't immediately visible. Right? Like that if you're gonna do a world is always going to be a thought experiment and it's never going to be fully internally consistent, right? Like one of the things that a science fiction story can do is like reach into our world and like pluck out a single item and then build a world in a bottle where that one item is like the most salient fact about it. And it's not accurate, it's just useful in the same way that when the doctor swabs your throat and then like puts it on a growth medium for a weekend and then looks at it on Monday, she doesn't have an accurate model of your body. She has this like usefully inaccurate model of your body where only one fact matters. And, you know, if you have to like make up an imaginary world and carry it off for 300 pages, all the internal contradictions of it are going to become more and more evident.
Yeah.
But in 12 pages, like it can just be, the internal contradictions can be entirely off stage and the reader might get all the way through without even noticing any of them.
Or you can be like, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I would actually even argue that they don't even matter that much because the short story, like the way I think of them, I tend to think of them as it's supposed to be like a small, like emotionally impactful thing. And so it can be weird and, you know, surreal and not make a whole lot of sense as long as it has that emotional impact. If you don't have the emotional impact, then you're just describing it, and that's, you know.
100%.
But so you're in a character or character's point of view, and they're feeling something very deeply, and you want the reader to feel it too, and that's what matters. And so the weird, fantastical, science fictional world building is like, a little bit like the foundation, but also like the decoration around it. You're making the emotions bigger there, which I guess you're doing in novels too, but yeah, you have to do it way more carefully because it will matter a lot more.
Totally.
I'm just going to say that I have been known to do full on novel size builds for 12-page short stories. I don't always advise this. It's fun. Only do it if you think it's fun.
Yeah, that can definitely get into writing related program activity instead of writing for
Yes, it can.
Well, another question that kind of connects here, Shannon asks, in addition to pacing, you were talking about fast-paced thrillers versus epic fantasy. What other narrative elements influence how you approach world building? And it kind of connects to another question, asking about things like point of view, and do you narrate from a character who's embedded in that world versus a character who's an outsider, and what kinds of approaches and techniques have you found really useful there in sort of conveying the world and telling the story?
Who wants to start?
I mean, I
can. Yeah, go.
Yeah, I'll go.
Yeah.
For me, the biggest one is it third person or first person? That changes everything for me. If it's third person, you can describe things that the character might not see, or but if it's first person, you have for me, it's a lot more opinionated. The opinions start to come in right away. So instead of just there's Twitter and Facebook, it's like, yes, I like Twitter better. Twitter is the quote unquote, it's not better. None of it is better. But it's all a lot of the details come out to be whether it's I'm doing like a third person limited or whether it's for first person, because everything is so much more linked to the opinion of the character, I think, in my work, in first person.
I just saw Ada Palmer do a presentation on something called protagonismo. That's a term that was coined by Joe Walton. And she described how outside of the pulp, so outside of genre, until pretty recently, like the 80s, it was not unusual for there not to be a hard distinction between first and third, and for third to waver a lot, like to have like, someone would check into a hotel and it would be like, Mr. Johnson stepped into the hotel and walked up to the desk, noticing that the lobby was clean. The clerk checked him in, noticing that his cuffs were worn and wondering if he'd had a long drive. Like that kind of wandering stuff was completely normal.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. Like,
it's very odd, and it's like kind of it tells you how parochial my reading is, that I have done so little reading outside of the genre, outside of contemporary non-genre work. Like I haven't read a lot of canon that isn't pulp before the 80s, and so I didn't know about any of this, and I've been kind of fooling around picking up the odd book after reading I went and read Joe's essay, and it's a fascinating phenomenon. It's not how I write.
No, not at all.
Well, since you're going on a research rabbit hole, we have a couple questions asking about your approach to research. Cory, you sort of talked a little bit about, you're drawing on so much that's happening right now, whereas Karen, it might be a little bit different, thinking of these sort of far future, spacefaring civilization
and I don't know if you saw, but Luis Avila in the comments has a question for Kali that ties into that, asking about how being a geophysicist ties into world building.
I wanted to make sure we got to Dr. Wallace and your thoughts about how your geophysics background influenced your work too. So why don't we start with you?
Yeah. Okay. I tend to have a probably frustratingly haphazard approach to research when I'm writing something. I tend to sort of cast a very wide net when I first get an idea and get like a general sense, and then go back and research the things I realize I need as I'm writing, or after I've written a first draft and realize that it's terrible and needs to be rewritten, which happens a lot for me. But I will say that this ties into the question about my scientific background, is that when writing specifically science fiction, but also when writing, I mean, because my background is in the earth sciences, like most things are set on planets that are, planets. So I will say that my background, even though I haven't written like a geology book or a book that is like about science fictional aspects of geology, at least not yet, what it does give me is that I know what I need to research. Like if I'm writing a book, like for example, with my most recent book, which is set on an asteroid, it's like, okay, I know that I need to figure out, okay, how much gravity does this have? What does that feel like? How do people move in that? Like what, how does living in that environment affect the human body? Those sorts of things, like, and I feel like I have a strong foundation, even though I'm not, an astrophysicist. I'm not a NASA scientist about human biology. I can go and look for that stuff because of the science background, which is the way I mostly use my science background now. The other way I use it is my research specifically was in like mountain building and plate tectonics and earthquakes, especially in the Himalayas and Tibet. So I write a lot about mountains because I love them, and because the settings that feel most interest to me are always in the mountains. And so people are like, how do you use your degree? It's like, well, I wrote another book set in the mountains and I'm going to write another one. And this is what it's like to live in the mountains. So that's, that's not a specific research approach, but I feel like you can't really ignore it because it's such a part of how I see the world that it's always there.
That's such a Stan Robinson kind of thing, that pastoralism and love for the mountains, especially.
Yeah.
He's since recanted, but like just before lockdown, he's one of the last people I saw in person. He was like, I'm not writing novels anymore. I'm just going to write a book about the Sierras.
Feel that way about the Adirondacks.
So Karen, what about for you then? How does research factor into your process?
Well, mine kind of also comes from the jobs I had when I was smaller and smaller. All right. So I started off as a journalist at a community weekly. And when you're at a weekly, there are like two of you and you cover literally everything. So I was always having to talk to these people who were doing things that I'd never thought of before, I've never experienced before. I would go talk to people about, I would get an assignment, and then 20 minutes later, I was in the car driving to talk to a guy who was doing a thing that I'd never talked about or had heard about. And so I had to learn enough to ask questions, learn enough to understand what they were doing, and learn enough to communicate it to the readers of the paper. And so that's pretty much where I am today. Because if you get too far in, the article's only like 1,000 words, 500 words, 1,000 words. You have to learn how to like distill it down into a certain point. So that's pretty much what I do now. Anything that I'll use an example. So in 200 years from now, and I'm going to murder this term because I've actually never heard it said out loud. The Alcubierre drive, which is kind of like a warp bubble type thing. That's how they get out there. That's how they move around space. But that's not where the story is going. So I just need to know that it works, or that it could work, or that it could work within, and how it works within the thing. I don't need to get into the warp bubble and into the mechanics of it. I like knowing in the world building where I can stop and where I can go, okay, I'm ready to write the article. Let's go.
Yeah.
I go in reverse. So this daily practice of taking all of the stuff that seems vaguely interesting, that I cast a very wide net for every morning. I have like a couple 100 bookmark tabs that I open in a tab group every morning, and I have a couple thousand RSS feeds and some mailing lists, and I just go through them all very quickly, grab the things that seem interesting and write them up. And that's research for the story I don't know I'm writing yet. That's the foundation for other work. And then when there's holes as I go along, generally they are atmospheric and not like structural. And I just write TK and go back to them later and fill them in so that I don't fall down a Wikipedia click trance. And then I can do writing and not writing related program activity during my writing blocks.
And we've got another question, and maybe Cory, this is a good one to start with you, but I think you'll have thoughts about how to find the right medium for the story that you're telling. So the person asking the question is, saying between novels, comics, short stories, video games. I think also about, adult, young adult, and you've all kind of worked across those boundaries. How do you, when you first have that idea for a story, how do you know what kind of container it's going to fit into?
Well, I think that there's a couple of really big differences in the media. Visual media, audiovisual media, movies, plays, they have no internality, right? Apart from the odd soliloquy or hacky voiceover, the internality is entirely conveyed by the actors doing stuff, emoting. And in novels, it's entirely explicit, or not entirely, but very explicit, often explicit. Novels are like grounded in the science fictional premise. All novels are grounded in the science fictional premise that one person can know what another person is thinking, which is something that no two people have ever experienced in the history of our human race, right? And so if the story turns on the internality of a character, you give yourself an easier job when you make it prose. Radio or audio drama, if it's drama and not a narrated story, obviously has no furniture. It has no setting. The setting is Foley and exposition and implication. And so to the extent that you want to do something visually interesting, obviously a visual medium is good, but an audio medium is the worst, right? Young adults has some really specific advantages in terms of plotting because young adults do things for the first time that we've done lots of times. And when you do something for the first time, if it's momentous, if it's important, then it's a one-way transformation. You're never the same person again. And so the first time you tell a lie of significance, it's incredibly dramatic. The 50th time you do it, it's incredibly banal. But it means that if you've got a story where you want some cheap and easy drama, and where you can have a lot of doing stuff for the first time without being contrived, then young adult fits really well.
And any other thoughts, Kali, Karen?
I've only written short stories and novels so far, so I clearly haven't yet found the story that's my screenplay.
Well, what about for you? Moving between young adult fiction and adults, and
I will say
fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah, I will say. I mean, I've written young adult horror and children's fantasy and adult sci-fi, a whole bunch of stuff, but I basically write them all the same way. I will say that usually it's as soon as I figure out the age of the main character that determines, at least gives me a guideline for what age group it will be in. Although there are clearly adult books that are about young children and teenagers. There's not so much the other way. You don't really find a lot of, although it's not impossible, it does happen, but like adult point of view characters in children's books. If you do that in YA, people will probably fight you on it, but you can definitely, argue it, and you can make it happen. But so it's basically just starts on, but like Cory said, when you're writing about young people, you have an obvious advantage in that they are being introduced to the world, whatever their world is, whether it's our world or a fantastical world. And realizing that a lot of the plotting in like middle grade and young adult books is about young people realizing that the world is not what they thought it was. Like that's a very general way of putting it, but that is, and that other people are not what they thought they were. They realize that adults are flawed, that, you know, that systems that are supposed to protect them are actually also very flawed. And these are things that apply in any aspect of world building. But so the question when you're looking at what age group to write is, you know, how do you want your main characters to view that at what level? And I mean, it varies a lot. I do think there's a lot of especially in like most modern YA, like YA is a very young category in terms of the history of publishing. They didn't used to call it that, but a lot of like teenage cynicism built into it. So if that's not the way you want to look at the world, middle grade is a much more like open-minded sort of like way of looking at whatever world you're building. Although again, there's exceptions. There's a book called Maggot Moon, which is one of the darkest books I've ever read. And it's a middle grade book about, it's hard to explain, but like, so there are always exceptions, but it is a lot about how you want to look at the world. So.
No, that's a great answer. And now I want to go find Maggot Moon. It's a dark middle grade.
It's really dark, and it's so good.
Well, I know we're coming up to the top of the hour. I think maybe this will be a good last question from an anonymous question saying, I come from Asia where writing and arts careers have always been discouraged. I've recently decided to get back into creative writing, woohoo. And after so many years, it is new and scary, which I can also relate to. So as a kind of closing thought, any tips for new writers focusing on their career? And maybe Karen, should we start with you since you're having your debut year in the middle of a worldwide pandemic?
I'm sorry, I missed the last 10 seconds because my internet went off.
Oh, so the question was any tips for new writers focusing on their careers? And if you need a minute because your internet was breaking down, we can come back. But
I have a couple. Being a new writer focusing on my career, I think the biggest one for me is don't forget what makes it fun for you. Like there's so much that new writers don't know about how publishing works, about how things are done, about, you know, what happens after this and what happens after that. And you can overwhelm yourself with getting all that information and kind of, you know, working with it. And I found that when I feel that way, and as a lot of people in my place in career do, is always remember what makes it fun for you. Write stories that find it that make you happy, right? Do the things that are do the things that fill your well, because in the end it's you and it's your keyboard and that's what it is. Everything else kind of comes from that. And if you're doing what you consider to be the thing that makes you the happiest or the most fulfilled in your work, then everything else gets a little easier.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
I would say the thing that nobody tells new writers, well, maybe not nobody, but that I wish more people would tell new writers is that nobody in publishing actually knows what's going to be popular in trends in like 2 years.
Nope.
They have no idea. They pick books they want to support. They throw a lot of support behind them. They pick books they don't support. But they don't chase trends because they're meaningless and they change constantly. And there's always going to be some, you know, wild card that nobody can predict. So write what you want to write and tell the stories that you really want to tell, because those are going to be the ones that like only you can tell from your life. Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to fit your stories into somebody else's like box to be like, oh, I want to target that agent, or I want to target that market, or I want to target that editor. It's probably going to be not work. It probably won't do super well, and it will be dissatisfying. So I would just say, like, there's a whole lot of pressure about like what's popular and what sells and what you have to do. And if you're trying to publish, you pay attention to that stuff. It's important. Like, the market pressures are real, but especially if you're writing, want to be writing long-term, nobody can predict what the future is going to look like and what people will want to read. And what they want to read are things that are interesting and well-written and exciting and fun and sad and that make them feel things. So focus on that instead, rather than on satisfying the publishing industry's like pressures.
And sometimes I like to tell people, you can't honestly, you have to understand what you can't control, and you have to understand what you can control. Like, I can control my writing. I can't control that my 2 books came out in the middle of a pandemic. Like, there's nothing in that I can control. So, and like, I always want to tell new writers that if you try to control the things you can't control, it's not pretty. It's
And
not
there's
pretty.
not a whole lot that you can control in publishing besides sitting your butt down and working. Like, you can always control that.
Yes.
The rest of it,
excellent advice.
like,
yeah, all those books on the shelves, they were bought 2 to 3 years ago.
I would say that, the first and most important piece of advice for people seeking advice from an established writer about how to break in is to remember that if you broke into the field 20 years ago, you know literally nothing about how to break into the field today. And it took me a while to figure this out, because I would go to panels as like a baby writer at conventions, and I would see established writers describe how to butter up John W. Campbell, who was on the one hand dead the year I was born, and on the other hand a fascist, or how to sell stories to magazines that didn't exist anymore.
yeah.
Isaac Asimov explaining that if you wanted to get the independent Teamsters who delivered paperbacks to spinner racks in pharmacies near universities to stock yours, that you should bring them donuts after the number of distributors had fallen from 400 to 3, and all the Teamsters had been fired, right? Like, this is not useful information. It's historic curiosity at this point. That said, I think that there are 2 pieces of universal advice. One is that if writing is what makes you happy and sane, that you should not tie it to doing things that are self-destructive. So the worst mistake I ever made was smoking while writing. It made me a smoker for a decade longer than I would have been otherwise, because I thought I couldn't quit without losing writing. And if the thing that makes you happy kills you, then you're going to laugh yourself to death. It's not nice. And then the other is to, as you've heard, just find the intrinsic joy, because the reality is that no one is going to care about what you're writing for a long time, right? Your writers group will maybe care a little if you can find a good one, but editors aren't going to care. Other writers aren't going to care. It's going to take you a long time to get good. And it's going to take you a long time to work out how to say the things that are unique to you, and say them in a way that makes other people excited. And if you can't find intrinsic motivation, you will fall at the first hurdle, because there's just such a protracted period in which the only person who's going to care about this thing that you are doing and working on and opening a vein for is you. And if you're not rewarding yourself, then you will have no reward.
Yeah.
And you may develop the superpower of being very good at sitting in discomfort for long periods of time. Well,
good chairs, important chairs. Get a really, really good chair. Sorry.
This is true. This is true. Well, we went a little over, but we hope we didn't impinge on your evening plans too much. And so just want to say a huge, huge thank you to our 3 amazing writers for being here. If we were all together in person, there would be massive round of applause. Make sure to check out their newest books, buy copies from your local indie bookstore, get the audiobook, get both versions, listen to it and read it. Why not? And thanks to everyone in the attendee section for taking part of your evening.
Thank you all
with
for
us.
coming.
Thank you.
All right, have a great night, everyone.
Good night.